The death toll in Gaza has now surpassed 10,000 people, 4,000 of which have been children. Water has become increasingly scarce and hospitals have been forced to close. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is getting worse and worse. In response to the situation, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres mentioned that something is clearly wrong. Simply too many civilians have lost their lives and continue to lose their lives on the Gaza Strip. For expressing these concerns about the mounting humanitarian crisis in Gaza and mentioning that the events that took place on the 7th of October didn't happen in a vacuum, Guterres has been facing calls by the Israeli ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, to resign.
But the Secretary General dared to say that the massacre did not happen in a vacuum. Yes, he deserves it. I slapped him and called for his immediate resignation. Shame on him.
The purpose of this type of reaction is to censor any type of inquiry towards the grotesque circumstances that have produced the situation in Gaza. Essentially, Israel becomes the victim even though it is the occupier. Israel, though, on the other hand, is still making assiduous attempts to justify this death toll. We've almost had it all. Some of the justifications include 1 million people can be taken as human shields, Hamas is attacking their own people in order to garner sympathy with human sacrifice central to their strategy. Civilians are being given a gracious 4-hour period to move to the southern area of Gaza, which by the way is still being bombarded with bombs. Alarmingly though, Israeli politicians have been quick to draw analogies between previous massacres carried out by Western powers and between what is happening in Gaza. Despite being a self-professed Palestinian liberation group, Hamas is constantly still being described as ISIS by Israeli propaganda. We see the narrative that Israel's fight is essentially a fight to kill people who, if let loose, will kill everyone in sight.
The Judeo-Christian story is that that transcendent power ends up being a story about freedom, about tempering power, about establishing institutions and establishing teachings that give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, that, don't matter.
Here we also see the Israeli President Isaac Herzog's response to Queen Rania of Jordan regarding her concern for Palestinian civilians.
By this philosophy of hate of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, Jihad, and the rest, they want all of us out of here, and they all want all of us wiped off, and they want a major Islamic fundamentalist regime throughout the Middle East. That's the real story.
We do not mean to labor the point, but it has to be recognized that this is how the threat of Hamas to the entire world is being construed. Here is a propaganda ad that has been made to deter Western audiences from rallying against Israeli massacres in Gaza.
We're going to get
Essentially, the enemy is as evil as the Nazis, as evil as ISIS, as evil as the Japanese in the Second World War. Essentially, whatever the West done to remove their existential threats, we too can do. Consider the following example. We have the case of the US Senator Lindsey Graham, who essentially mentions that we should stop whitewashing all of this talk about Palestinian civilians. Essentially for him, this is just how Western armies do things. Stop all of this talk about genocide.
One thing I want to say for sure is Israel is not engaged in genocide. And another thing we need to deal with is the whitewashing of the status of people in Gaza. I'm sure there are plenty of people who would love to be free from Hamas, but the most radicalized people on the planet live at the Gaza Strip.
We also have an example in Elon Levy, an Israeli government spokesperson who posted a picture of ruined Fallujah, and he mentioned drone footage of Mosul after the 86 members of the international coalition against ISIS were done with it. We also have the case of the Zionist apologist Ben Shapiro referencing Dresden when discussing at the Oxford Union.
You should talk to the people in Dresden, but you can't because they're dead.
Essentially, what seems to be the case is Israel is using the military record of the West to justify its massacres in Gaza. What is that military record? Fallujah was leveled to the ground with uranium-depleted weapons used in Iraq. Estimates for the civilian death toll in Dresden go from 25,000 to 250,000. Estimates for the death toll in Hiroshima and Nagasaki go as high as 200,000. By these comparisons, what is happening in Gaza seems relatively mild. However, what Israel is currently doing is a replication of what Western powers have done to civilian populations whenever they have deemed expedient. Cutting food, electricity, and water may for many seem very, very cruel. But do you remember the 90s when America sanctioned Iraq, which eventually led to the death of around 500,000 children? Do you remember what the US Secretary of State said regarding that United States calculation?
500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
10,000 dead in Gaza pales in comparison to the hundreds and thousands of people that lost their lives as a result of the American war machine in Yemen, Somalia, Iraq, Vietnam. Perhaps the reason why the West does not get involved and rein in on Israel's genocide in Gaza is because when they look at the fuel-shortened, depleted hospitals with bodies piling up, they only see a reflection of their own actions. Perhaps when they see Palestinian prisoners being tortured, they see Abu Ghraib in Iraq. There has been a lot of talk about Israel breaking international laws. However, as far as the West's military history goes, it seems that Israel is playing firmly within the rules.